Hello and welcome. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep. So before we begin, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where you're from and at what time you're watching. Take a moment to get comfortable, relax, and let yourself unwind. Name of the story: The Forgotten Patient. The wind howled outside the abandoned asylum, its broken windows rattling like the teeth of a chattering skeleton. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long, jagged shadows across the overgrown courtyard. Inside, Nurse Clara Thompson adjusted her flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick darkness of the hallway. Her footsteps echoed softly against the cracked tiles, each step a reminder of how alone she was in this decaying place. Clara had been assigned the night shift at Blackwood Asylum, a place that had been shut down for over 2 decades. The building was a relic of a darker time, a time when patients were subjected to cruel experiments and forgotten by the world. The staff had warned her about the eerie atmosphere, but Clara had brushed it off. She needed the job, and besides, she didn't believe in ghosts. But now, as she walked down the dimly lit corridor, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't alone. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something metallic like blood. She paused, her flashlight flickering for a moment, and that's when she heard it. A faint cry. It was so soft, so distant, that Clara wasn't sure if she had imagined it. She stood still, holding her breath, listening. The cry came again, louder this time, a desperate plea for help. It seemed to be coming from the East Wing, a part of the asylum that had been sealed off for years. Clara hesitated. Her rational mind told her to ignore it, to stay in the safety of the main building. But her instincts, the part of her that had made her a nurse in the first place, urged her to investigate. She tightened her grip on the flashlight and headed toward the sound. The East Wing was even darker than the rest of the asylum, the walls lined with peeling paint and graffiti. The cries grew louder as she approached a heavy metal door, its surface rusted and covered in chains. The door was slightly ajar, the chains broken, as if someone or something had forced their way through. Clara pushed the door open, the hinges screeching in protest. The room beyond was small and cluttered, filled with old medical equipment and dusty files. In the center of the room was a gurney, its straps hanging loose and stained with dark, dried blood. The cries stopped. Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped further into the room. Her flashlight beam landed on a filing cabinet in the corner, its drawers half open. She approached it cautiously, her fingers trembling as she pulled out a folder. The name on the file was barely legible, but she could make out the words, Patient 37. She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the faded documents. The patient's name was Evelyn Hart, a young woman admitted to the asylum in 1978. The notes were sparse, but one sentence stood out. Subject exhibits extreme resistance to treatment. Recommend further experimentation. Clara's stomach churned as she flipped through the pages. There were diagrams, notes on procedures that made no sense, and photographs of Evelyn, her face gaunt, her eyes hollow. The last entry was dated October 31st, 1983. It read, Patient expired during final procedure. Body disposed of in accordance with protocol. A cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the flashlight. Clara gasped, fumbling with the switch, but it wouldn't turn back on. She was plunged into complete darkness, the only sound her rapid breathing. And then a voice. Help me! It was a whisper, so close that Clara could feel the breath on her ear. She spun around, but there was no one there. The voice came again, louder this time, filled with anguish. Please help me! Clara's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, the folder slipping from her hands. The room grew colder, the air thick with the scent of decay. She could feel something, someone, standing over her, their presence heavy and suffocating. Who are you? Clara stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The response was a low, guttural growl. You took everything from me. Clara's mind raced. She had never been here before, never even heard of Blackwood Asylum until a week ago. "I didn't do anything to you," she cried. The voice laughed, a sound that sent shivers down her spine. "You're one of them. You wear their uniform, you carry their tools. You're just like the rest." Clara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I'm not. I'm just a nurse. I didn't know about this place, about what they did to you." There was a long silence, and then the voice softened. "Prove it." "How?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. "Find my body," the voice said. "Set me free." The room fell silent, the presence lifting as quickly as it had come. Clara sat there for what felt like hours, her mind racing. She didn't know if she was losing her mind or if this was real, but she knew one thing. She had to find Evelyn Hart's body. She grabbed the folder and stumbled out of the room, her flashlight flickering back to life. The cries started again, guiding her deeper into the asylum, toward a place she had never been before, a place where the forgotten patient waited. Clara's footsteps echoed through the narrow, crumbling hallways as she followed the faint cries. The sound led her deeper into the asylum, past rooms filled with rusted beds, broken mirrors, and shattered glass. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls seemed to close in around her. The flashlight in her hand flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows that danced like specters on the walls. The cries grew louder, more desperate, pulling her toward a set of stairs leading down to the basement. Clara hesitated at the top of the staircase, her heart pounding in her chest. The stairs were steep and uneven, the wooden steps warped and splintered. She gripped the railing, which felt damp and slimy under her fingers, and took a deep breath before descending. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and locked doors. The air was thick with the smell of mold and something else, something sharp and chemical, like antiseptic gone sour. The cries seemed to be coming from all directions now, echoing off the walls and making it impossible to pinpoint their source. Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she pressed forward, her flashlight beam trembling in her hand. "Evelyn," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. "Where are you?" The cries stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in their wake. Clara froze, her ears straining for any sound. Then, from somewhere ahead, she heard a faint scratching noise, like nails dragging against wood. She followed the sound, her footsteps slow and deliberate, until she reached a heavy metal door at the end of the corridor. The door was slightly ajar, and the scratching was coming from inside. Clara pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was small and windowless, its walls lined with shelves filled with jars of strange, unidentifiable substances. In the center of the room was a metal table, its surface stained with dark, dried blood. And on the floor, in the far corner, was a figure. It was a woman, her body emaciated and her skin pale and translucent. She was crouched on the floor, her long, tangled hair covering her face. Her fingers clawed at the ground, leaving deep gouges in the wood. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the woman slowly turned her head, her hollow eyes locking onto Clara's. "You came," the woman said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I knew you would." Clara took a step back, her heart racing. "Evelyn?" The woman nodded, her movements slow and deliberate. "They left me here," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "They took everything from me, my life, my body, my soul. And then they left me here to rot." Clara's mind raced. She didn't know what to say, what to do. I didn't know," she stammered. "I didn't know about any of this. I want to help you." Evelyn's eyes narrowed, her gaze piercing. "Help me," she repeated, her voice rising. "How can you help me? You're one of them. You wear their uniform, you carry their tools. You're just like the rest." Clara shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I'm not. I'm just a nurse. I didn't know about this place, about what they did to you. I swear I didn't know." Evelyn stared at her for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she extended a hand, her fingers trembling. "If you want to help me, she said, her voice softening. Then find my body. Set me free. Clara hesitated, her mind racing. Your body? Where is it? Evelyn's eyes filled with tears, and she pointed to the metal table in the center of the room. There, she whispered. They cut me open. They took pieces of me. And then they left me here, in this room, to die. Clara's stomach churned as she looked at the table, the dark stains suddenly taking on a new, horrifying meaning. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. Okay, she said, her voice steady. I'll find your body. I'll set you free. But I need you to tell me what to do. Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not leaving me here. Clara stepped closer, her flashlight beam illuminating the room. She began to search, her hands trembling as she opened drawers and cabinets, looking for anything that might help her. The air grew colder with every passing moment, and the shadows seemed to shift and twist around her. She could feel Evelyn's presence, heavy and suffocating, watching her every move. Finally, in the bottom drawer of a rusted filing cabinet, she found a small, leather-bound journal. The pages were yellowed and brittle, the handwriting cramped and difficult to read. But as Clara flipped through the journal, she realized what it was, a record of the experiments performed on Evelyn Hart. The entries were detailed and horrifying, describing procedures that made Clara's stomach turn. They had taken organs, tissue samples, even bone marrow, all in the name of science. And at the end of the journal, there was a note, subject expired during final procedure. Body disposed of in incinerator. Clara's heart sank. The incinerator. That's where Evelyn's body had been taken. She closed the journal and turned to Evelyn, who was still crouched in the corner, watching her with hollow eyes. I found it, Clara said, her voice trembling. Your body, it was burned. In the incinerator. Evelyn's expression darkened, her eyes filling with rage. No, she whispered. No, no, no. Clara took a step back, her heart pounding. I'm sorry, she said, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know. Evelyn's body began to tremble, her fingers clawing at the ground. They took everything from me, she hissed, her voice rising. Everything. And now I can't even rest. I can't even be free. Clara's mind raced. She didn't know what to do, how to help. Is there anything else I can do? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and desperation. Yes, she said, her voice trembling. There is one thing. Clara hesitated. What is it? Evelyn's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. You can join me. Before Clara could react, Evelyn lunged at her, her fingers clawing at Clara's throat. Clara screamed, struggling to break free, but Evelyn's grip was like iron. The room spun around her, the walls closing in, the air growing colder and colder. And then, everything went black. When Clara opened her eyes, she was no longer in the basement. She was standing in a long, dimly lit hallway, the walls lined with doors that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick with the scent of antiseptic and something else, something metallic, like blood. She looked down at her hands, which were trembling, and realized she was still holding the flashlight. But something was different. The beam of light was faint, flickering weakly, as if the batteries were dying. Where am I? Clara whispered, her voice echoing down the hallway. There was no response, only the sound of her own breathing and the faint hum of fluorescent lights above her. She took a step forward, her footsteps echoing softly against the tiled floor. The doors on either side of her were closed, their surfaces covered in peeling paint and rusted handles. She reached out to touch one of the doors, but before her fingers could make contact, she heard a voice. You shouldn't be here. Clara spun around, her heart racing. Standing at the end of the hallway was a figure, a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her hair long and tangled, her face pale and gaunt. It was Evelyn. Evelyn, Clara stammered, taking a step back. What is this place? Evelyn's hollow eyes locked onto Clara's, her expression unreadable. This is where they brought me, she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. This is where they did it, where they took everything from me. Clara's mind raced. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew one thing. She had to get out of here. I need to leave, she said, her voice trembling. Please, just let me go. Evelyn tilted her head, her lips curling into a faint, bitter smile. You can't leave, she said. Not until you've seen what they did. Not until you understand. Before Clara could respond, the doors along the hallway began to creak open, one by one. From each door emerged a figure, men and women in hospital gowns, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They shuffled toward her, their movements slow and deliberate, their hands reaching out as if to grab her. Clara's breath came in short, shallow gasps as she backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. Stay back, she cried, her voice trembling. Please just stay back. But the figures kept coming, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their hands clawing at the air. Clara turned and ran, her footsteps echoing loudly against the tiled floor. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the doors and figures blurring together as she ran. She could hear Evelyn's voice behind her, whispering in her ear. You can't escape, Evelyn said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and sadness. You're one of them now. Clara's legs gave out, and she collapsed to the floor, her flashlight slipping from her hand. The figures surrounded her, their hands reaching out, their hollow eyes staring into hers. She closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face, and waited for the end. But it didn't come. Instead, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, and when she opened her eyes, she was back in the basement. Evelyn was crouched in front of her, her expression softer now, her eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry, Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't mean to. I just wanted you to understand. Clara's mind raced. She didn't know what to say, what to do. I understand, she stammered. I understand what they did to you. And I'm so sorry. Evelyn nodded, her tears falling silently. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not leaving me here. Clara reached out, her hand trembling as she placed it on Evelyn's shoulder. I won't leave you, she said, her voice steady. I'll help you. I'll find a way to set you free. Evelyn's lips curled into a faint, grateful smile. There is one way, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it won't be easy. Clara hesitated. What is it? Evelyn's eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. You have to find the others, she said. The ones who did this to me. The ones who are still out there. You have to make them pay. Clara's heart sank. She didn't know if she could do it, if she had the strength. But as she looked into Evelyn's eyes, she knew she had no choice. I'll do it, she said, her voice steady. I'll find them. I'll make them pay. Evelyn nodded, her expression softening. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you for not leaving me here. Clara took a deep breath, her mind racing. She didn't know where to start, how to find the people responsible for Evelyn's suffering. But she knew one thing, she couldn't stay here. She had to leave, to find the answers she needed. She stood up, her legs trembling, and turned to Evelyn. I'll come back, she said, her voice steady. I promise. Evelyn nodded, her eyes filled with gratitude. I'll be waiting, she whispered. Clara turned and walked out of the basement, her footsteps echoing softly against the cracked tiles. The air grew warmer as she climbed the stairs, the oppressive weight of the basement lifting with every step. But as she reached the top of the stairs, she heard Evelyn's voice one last time. Don't forget me, Evelyn whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of hope and fear. Don't let them forget. Clara nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of her promise. I won't, she whispered. I won't forget. And with that, she walked out of the asylum, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. But as she stepped into the sunlight, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that Evelyn's presence was still with her, guiding her, urging her forward. The morning sun did little to warm Clara as she stood outside the asylum, her breath visible in the crisp air. The events of the night felt like a nightmare, but the weight of Evelyn's journal in her hands was a stark reminder that it had all been real. She glanced back at the crumbling building, its broken windows like hollow eyes staring back at her. The asylum seemed quieter now, almost peaceful, but Clara knew better. The horrors within its walls were far from over. She took a deep breath and began walking toward her car, her mind racing. Evelyn's words echoed in her head. Find the others. Make them pay. But who were the others? The doctors, the nurses, the staff who had carried out those unspeakable experiments? Were they still alive? And if they were, how would she find them? Clara reached her car and slid into the driver's seat, placing the journal on the passenger side. She stared at it for a moment, her fingers trembling as she traced the faded leather. The answers had to be in there. She opened the journal and began flipping through the pages, her eyes scanning the cramped handwriting. Names, dates, procedures. It was all there, a record of the atrocities committed at Blackwood Asylum. One name stood out, Dr. Arthur Grayson. He was mentioned repeatedly in the journal, often as the lead physician overseeing Evelyn's treatments. Clara's stomach churned as she read the details of the experiments he had conducted, the cold, clinical language making them all the more horrifying. If anyone knew the full extent of what had happened at Blackwood, it was him. Clara pulled out her phone and searched for Dr. Arthur Grayson. To her surprise, she found him almost immediately. He was retired now, living in a small town about 2 hours away. Her heart raced as she stared at the address on her screen. This was it. This was where she would start. The drive felt endless. Clara's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over. Evelyn's hollow eyes, her desperate pleas, the cold, suffocating presence in the basement, it all haunted her. She couldn't shake the feeling that Evelyn was still with her, watching, waiting. When she finally arrived at Dr. Grayson's house, it was a modest, unassuming place, a far cry from the horrors he had orchestrated. Clara parked her car and sat there for a moment, gathering her courage. She didn't know what she would say, how she would confront him, but she knew she had to try. She walked up to the front door and knocked, her heart pounding in her chest. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then, the door creaked open, and an elderly man peered out at her. He was thin, with silver hair and sharp, piercing eyes. Clara recognized him immediately from the photos in the journal. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm and measured. Clara took a deep breath. "Dr. Grayson," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her. "My name is Clara Thompson. I need to talk to you about Blackwood Asylum." The man's expression darkened, and for a moment, Clara thought he might slam the door in her face. But instead, he stepped aside and gestured for her to come in. "I suppose it was only a matter of time," he said quietly. The inside of the house was neat and orderly, but there was a coldness to it, a sterility that reminded Clara of the asylum. Dr. Grayson led her to a small sitting room and motioned for her to sit. He took a seat across from her, his hands folded neatly in his lap. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his tone resigned. Clara hesitated, unsure where to begin. I found Evelyn Hart's records," she said finally. "I know what you did to her. What you did to all of them." Dr. Grayson's expression didn't change. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this. "I see," he said. "And what do you plan to do with that information?" Clara's hands clenched into fists. "I want the truth," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "I want to know why. Why did you do it? How could you do something so monstrous?" For a long moment, Dr. Grayson was silent. Then, he sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You have to understand," he said, his voice calm and detached. "We were pioneers. We were pushing the boundaries of science, of medicine. What we did, it was for the greater good." Clara stared at him in disbelief. "The greater good," she repeated, her voice rising. "You tortured people. You destroyed lives. How can you possibly justify that?" Dr. Grayson's expression hardened. You weren't there, he said sharply. You don't understand the pressure we were under, the expectations. We were told to find answers, no matter the cost. And we did. Our work saved lives. Clara shook her head, tears of anger and frustration welling up in her eyes. Your work destroyed lives, she said, her voice trembling. Evelyn Hart died because of you. And now her spirit is trapped, unable to rest. Because of you. For the first time, Dr. Grayson's calm demeanor faltered. He looked away, his hands trembling slightly. Evelyn, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I never wanted it to go that far. But she was special. Her case was unique. We thought we could learn something from her. Clara's heart ached with a mixture of anger and pity. She was a person, she said, her voice breaking. Not an experiment. Not a case. A person. Dr. Grayson didn't respond. He simply sat there, his head bowed, his hands trembling. Clara took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. I need your help, she said finally. I need to set her free. I need to make this right. Dr. Grayson looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. I don't know if you can, he said quietly. What we did, it's not something that can be undone. Clara's hands clenched into fists. I have to try, she said, her voice steady. And you're going to help me. Dr. Grayson hesitated, then nodded slowly. What do you need? He asked. Clara took a deep breath. I need the names, she said. The names of everyone involved. And I need you to tell me everything. Everything you did, everything you know. No more lies. No more excuses. Dr. Grayson stared at her for a long moment, then nodded again. All right, he said quietly. I'll tell you everything. Clara sat in silence as Dr. Grayson began to speak, his voice low and filled with a weight that seemed to press down on the room. He started with the early days of Blackwood Asylum, when it was still a functioning institution, and the pressure from higher authorities to produce groundbreaking results in the field of psychiatric treatment. The more he spoke, the more Clara's stomach churned. The experiments weren't just cruel. They were calculated, systematic, and utterly devoid of humanity. We were told to push the boundaries, Dr. Grayson said, his hands trembling as he clasped them together, to explore the limits of the human mind and body. Evelyn, she was one of our most promising subjects. Her resilience was unlike anything we'd ever seen, but it wasn't enough. They wanted more. They always wanted more. Clara's fists clenched in her lap. Who's they? She asked, her voice tight with anger. Dr. Grayson hesitated, his eyes darting to the window as if someone might be listening. The board, he said finally. The people funding the research. They didn't care about the cost. They just wanted results. And when she didn't survive the final procedure, they covered it up. They made her disappear. Clara's heart ached as she thought of Evelyn, alone and forgotten in that dark basement. And the others, she asked. The other patients? What happened to them? Dr. Grayson's face paled, and he looked away. Some survived, he said quietly, but many didn't. And those who did, they were never the same. We destroyed them. We destroyed everything. Clara's mind raced. She needed more than just Dr. Grayson's confession. She needed proof, something tangible that could bring the truth to light. Do you have records? She asked. Documents, names, anything that could expose what happened. Dr. Grayson nodded slowly. I kept copies, he said. I knew one day someone might come asking questions. They're in the basement. I'll show you. He stood, his movements slow and deliberate, and led Clara down a narrow staircase to the basement of his home. The air was damp and cold, the walls lined with shelves filled with boxes and old medical equipment. Dr. Grayson walked to a corner and pulled out a dusty box, its contents spilling over as he set it on a table. It's all here, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Everything you need. Clara opened the box, her hands trembling as she sifted through the documents. There were patient files, photographs, and detailed reports of the experiments. Each page was a testament to the horrors that had taken place at Blackwood Asylum. She felt a surge of anger and determination. This was it. This was how she would make them pay. But as she flipped through the files, something caught her eye. A photograph of a group of doctors and staff standing in front of the asylum. Dr. Grayson was among them, his face young and stern. But it wasn't him that made Clara's blood run cold. It was the man standing next to him, his arm draped casually over Dr. Grayson's shoulder. It was her father. Clara's breath caught in her throat, and she stumbled back, the photograph slipping from her hands. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "No, this can't be right." Dr. Grayson looked at her, his expression filled with pity. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't know how to tell you." Clara's mind raced, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. Her father had worked at Blackwood Asylum. He had been part of this. How could she not have known? How could he have kept this from her? "Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why didn't you tell me?" Dr. Grayson sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I thought you knew," he said. "I thought that's why you came here. But now I see, you had no idea." Clara's legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her hands clutching the photograph. Her father's face stared back at her, smiling as if he hadn't a care in the world. How could he have been part of something so monstrous? How could he have lived with himself? "I need to talk to him," she said finally, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "I need to hear it from him." Dr. Grayson nodded. "I understand," he said, "but be careful. The truth, it's not always what we want to hear." Clara stood, clutching the box of documents to her chest. "Thank you," she said, her voice cold, "for telling me the truth." Dr. Grayson didn't respond. He simply watched as she turned and walked up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Clara drove to her father's house in a daze, her mind replaying the conversation with Dr. Grayson over and over. Her father had always been a quiet, reserved man, but she had never imagined he was capable of something like this. She pulled into the driveway and sat there for a moment, staring at the house she had grown up in. It felt different now, tainted by the secrets it held. She walked up to the front door and knocked, her heart pounding in her chest. After a moment, the door opened, and her father stood there, his face lighting up with a smile. "Clara," he said, his voice warm. "What a surprise. Come in, come in." Clara stepped inside, the box of documents clutched tightly in her arms. Her father led her to the living room, his expression turning to concern as he noticed the look on her face. "Is everything all right?" he asked. Clara set the box on the coffee table and took a deep breath. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice steady. "About Blackwood Asylum." Her father's smile faded, and he sank into a chair, his face pale. "I see," he said quietly. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." Clara's hands clenched into fists. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice trembling. "How could you keep something like this from me?" Her father looked away, his hands trembling. "I wanted to protect you," he said finally. "I didn't want you to know the kind of man I was. The things I did. I've spent my whole life trying to forget." Clara's heart ached with a mixture of anger and pity. "You can't just forget," she said, her voice breaking. "You have to face it. You have to make it right." Her father looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I don't know if I can," he whispered, "but I'll try. For you, I'll try." Clara sat across from her father, the weight of his confession pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. The man she had looked up to her entire life, the man who had taught her to be kind and compassionate, had been part of something unspeakable. She felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her, leaving her suspended in a void of disbelief and betrayal. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "No more secrets. No more lies." Her father nodded, his hands trembling as he clasped them together. "It started small," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. At first, it was just observations. We were studying the effects of isolation, of sensory deprivation. But then they wanted more. They wanted us to push further, to see how far we could go. Clara's stomach churned as she listened, her mind racing to reconcile the man in front of her with the horrors he was describing. "And you went along with it," she said, her voice tight with anger. "You just went along with it." Her father looked away, his face pale and drawn. "I told myself it was for the greater good," he said, his voice trembling. "That we were advancing science, that we were helping people. But the truth is, I was afraid of losing my job, my reputation, everything I had worked for. And by the time I realized what we were doing was wrong, it was too late. I was in too deep." Clara's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. "And Evelyn?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What about her?" Her father's face crumpled, and he buried his head in his hands. "Evelyn," he whispered, his voice filled with anguish. "She was different, stronger than the others. They thought she could withstand more, that she could give us the answers we were looking for. But we were wrong. We pushed her too far, and she didn't make it." Clara's heart ached as she thought of Evelyn, alone and forgotten in that dark basement. "And you just left her there," she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You left her there to rot." Her father looked up at her, his eyes filled with tears. "I wanted to stop," he said, his voice breaking. "I wanted to tell someone, to put an end to it. But I was too much of a coward. And now I have to live with what I've done." Clara stared at him, her mind racing. She didn't know what to say, how to feel. Part of her wanted to scream at him, to make him understand the pain he had caused. But another part of her, the part that still loved him, ached with pity. He was a broken man, haunted by the ghosts of his past. "You have to help me," she said finally, her voice steady. "You have to help me set this right. For Evelyn, for all of them." Her father nodded, his expression filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said. "But it won't be easy. The people behind this, they're powerful. They'll do anything to protect their secrets." Clara's jaw tightened. "I don't care," she said. "They have to pay for what they've done. And if you won't help me, I'll do it alone." Her father reached out, his hand trembling as he placed it on hers. "I'll help you," he said, his voice firm. "I owe you that much. And I owe Evelyn." The days that followed were a blur of research and planning. Clara and her father worked tirelessly, poring over the documents from Dr. Grayson's basement and piecing together the full extent of the atrocities committed at Blackwood Asylum. They uncovered names, dates, and locations, building a case that would expose the truth to the world. But as they dug deeper, the danger grew. Clara began to notice strange things. A car parked outside her house for hours at a time, phone calls with no one on the other end, the feeling of being watched wherever she went. She knew they were being monitored, that the people behind Blackwood were trying to silence them. But she refused to back down. One night, as Clara was working late, she heard a noise outside her window. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest, and slowly turned to look. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the shadow of someone standing there, watching her. She grabbed her phone and called her father, her hands trembling. "They're here," she whispered. "I think they're here." Her father's voice was calm but urgent. "Lock the doors," he said. "Don't let anyone in." "I'm on my way." Clara did as he said, her mind racing. She grabbed the box of documents and hid it under her bed, then sat in the corner of the room, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. The minutes felt like hours as she waited, her ears straining for any sound. Finally, she heard a knock at the door. "Clara," her father's voice called. "It's me. Open the door." She rushed to the door and unlocked it, her heart pounding. Her father stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. "We need to go," he said. "Now." Clara nodded, grabbing the box of documents and following him to the car. They drove in silence, the tension thick in the air. Clara didn't ask where they were going. She trusted her father to keep her safe. They arrived at a small, secluded cabin in the woods, far from prying eyes. Her father led her inside, his movements quick and deliberate. "We'll be safe here," he said. "For now." Clara set the box of documents on the table and took a deep breath. "What do we do now?" she asked. Her father looked at her, his expression filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We finish what we started," he said. "We expose the truth, no matter what it takes." Clara and her father spent the next few days in the cabin, working tirelessly to compile the evidence they had gathered. The documents from Dr. Grayson's basement were damning, detailing not only the experiments conducted at Blackwood Asylum, but also the names of those who had funded and supported them. Powerful people, politicians, businessmen, even high-ranking medical officials, were implicated in the horrors that had taken place. As they worked, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The cabin was remote, surrounded by dense woods, but she often caught herself glancing out the windows, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. Her father noticed her unease and tried to reassure her, but even he seemed on edge, his eyes darting to the door at every creak and groan of the old cabin. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the woods were bathed in an eerie twilight, Clara sat at the table, her fingers tracing the edges of a photograph. It was the same one she had found in Dr. Grayson's basement, the group of doctors and staff standing in front of Blackwood Asylum. Her father was in the photo, his face young and stern, but it was the man standing next to him that held her attention. He was tall, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. According to the documents, his name was Victor Hargrove, the mastermind behind the experiments. "Who is he?" Clara asked, holding up the photograph. "Victor Hargrove. What kind of person could do something like this?" Her father sighed, his shoulders slumping as he sat down across from her. "Victor was brilliant," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But he was also ruthless. He believed the ends justified the means, no matter how horrific. And he had a way of convincing others to follow him, to believe in his vision." Clara's jaw tightened. "And you followed him," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. Her father nodded, his eyes filled with shame. "I did," he admitted. "I told myself I was doing it for the greater good, but the truth is, I was afraid of him, afraid of losing everything. And by the time I realized how wrong it all was, it was too late." Clara looked down at the photograph, her heart aching with a mixture of anger and pity. "We have to stop him," she said, her voice steady. "We have to make sure he can't hurt anyone else." Her father reached across the table, his hand trembling as he placed it on hers. "We will," he said, "but we have to be careful. Victor is dangerous, and he'll do whatever it takes to protect himself." The next morning, Clara woke to the sound of her father's voice, low and urgent. She sat up, her heart racing, and saw him standing by the window, peering out through a crack in the curtains. "What is it?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her father turned to her, his face pale. "There's someone outside," he said. "I don't know how they found us, but we need to go. Now." Clara's mind raced as she grabbed the box of documents and followed her father to the back door. They slipped outside, the cold morning air biting at their skin, and hurried into the woods. The trees were thick, their branches intertwining overhead and casting the forest floor in shadow. Clara's heart pounded as she ran, her footsteps crunching against the fallen leaves. Behind them, she heard voices, angry, shouting voices. They were getting closer. "This way," her father whispered, pulling her off the path and into a dense thicket. They crouched down, their breaths coming in short, shallow gasps, and waited. The voices grew louder, closer. Clara's heart felt like it was going to burst out of her chest as she clutched the box of documents to her chest. She could see shadows moving through the trees, hear the crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the voices faded, the shadows retreating back the way they had come. Clara let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with relief. "They're gone," she whispered. Her father nodded, his face grim. "For now," he said, "but they'll be back. We need to get out of here." They made their way to a nearby town, where they found a small, run-down motel on the outskirts. Clara paid for the room in cash, not wanting to leave a paper trail, and they settled in, the box of documents sitting heavily on the table between them. "What do we do now?" Clara asked, her voice filled with frustration. "We can't keep running forever." Her father sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "We need to get this evidence to someone who can help," he said. "Someone who can't be bought or intimidated." Clara thought for a moment, then nodded. "The press," she said. "If we can get this to a journalist, someone with a reputation for exposing corruption, we might have a chance." Her father hesitated, then nodded. "It's risky," he said, "but it might be our only option." They spent the rest of the day researching journalists, looking for someone who had a history of taking on powerful figures. Finally, they found a name, Sarah Mitchell, an investigative reporter known for her fearless exposés. Clara sent her an anonymous email, attaching scanned copies of some of the documents and arranging a meeting. 2 days later, Clara and her father sat in a dimly lit cafe, waiting for Sarah Mitchell to arrive. Clara's hands were clenched around a cup of coffee, her nerves on edge. She kept glancing at the door, half expecting Victor Hargrove or one of his lackeys to burst in at any moment. Finally, the door opened and a woman walked in. She was tall, with sharp features and a no-nonsense demeanor. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on Clara and her father, and walked over to their table. "You must be Clara," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Sarah." Clara shook her hand, her grip firm despite her nerves. "Thank you for meeting us," she said. Sarah sat down, her eyes narrowing as she looked at the box of documents on the table. "I read what you sent me," she said. "If even half of it is true, this could be the biggest story of my career." "It's all true," Clara said, her voice steady. "And there's more, much more." Sarah leaned forward, her expression intense. "Tell me everything." Clara and her father spent the next hour recounting everything they knew. The experiments at Blackwood Asylum, the names of those involved, and the lengths they had gone to cover up their crimes. Sarah listened intently, her expression growing darker with each revelation. By the time they finished, she was silent for a long moment, her fingers drumming against the table. "This is bigger than I thought," she said finally. "If we're going to expose this, we need to move carefully. These people are dangerous, and they won't hesitate to silence anyone who gets in their way." Clara nodded, her heart pounding. "We know," she said, "but we can't let them get away with this. Not after everything they've done." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing as she thought. "All right," she said, "here's what we're going to do. I'll start working on the story, but I'll need more evidence, something concrete that ties these people directly to the experiments." "Do you have anything like that?" Clara glanced at her father, who nodded. "We have recordings," he said, "old audio logs from the asylum. They detail the procedures, the names of the patients, and the orders given by Victor Hargrove. They're hard to listen to, but they're proof." Sarah's eyes lit up. "That's exactly what we need," she said. "Get me those recordings, and I'll make sure the world hears them." Over the next few days, Clara and her father worked closely with Sarah, providing her with everything she needed to build the story. They stayed in the motel, rarely venturing outside, and communicated with Sarah through encrypted messages. The tension was palpable, each day feeling like a countdown to something inevitable. One evening, as Clara was organizing the last of the documents, her father walked into the room, his face pale. "We need to leave," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." Clara's heart skipped a beat. "What's wrong?" "I just got a call from an old colleague," he said. "Victor knows we're here. He's coming." Clara's mind raced as she grabbed the box of documents and followed her father out the door. They hurried to the car, the night air cold and biting, and drove away from the motel, the headlights cutting through the darkness. But they didn't get far. As they turned onto a deserted road, a pair of headlights appeared behind them, closing in fast. Clara's father gripped the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles white. "Hold on," he said, his voice tense. The car behind them sped up, ramming into their bumper and sending them skidding off the road. Clara screamed as the car crashed into a ditch, the impact knocking the breath out of her. She looked over at her father, who was slumped over the steering wheel, blood trickling down his forehead. "Dad," she cried, shaking him. "Dad, wake up!" Before she could react, the door was ripped open, and a pair of hands dragged her out of the car. She struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. The man holding her was strong, his grip like iron. "Let her go," a voice said, cold and commanding. Clara looked up to see Victor Hargrove standing in front of her, his sharp features illuminated by the headlights of his car. He was older now, his hair gray and his face lined with age, but his eyes were just as cold and calculating as they had been in the photograph. "You've caused quite a bit of trouble," Victor said, his voice calm but laced with menace. "But it ends here." Clara's heart pounded as she glared at him. "You can't silence us," she said, her voice trembling but defiant. "The truth is out there. People will know what you've done." Victor smiled, a chilling, mirthless smile. "The truth is whatever I say it is," he said. "And as for you, well, let's just say you'll be joining your friend Evelyn." Clara's blood ran cold as Victor nodded to the man holding her. He began dragging her toward the car, her struggles growing weaker as fear and exhaustion took over. But just as they reached the car, a loud bang echoed through the night, and the man holding her suddenly let go, collapsing to the ground. Clara stumbled back, her eyes wide as she saw Sarah Mitchell standing a few feet away, a gun in her hand. Behind her were several police cars, their lights flashing and sirens blaring. "It's over, Victor," Sarah said, her voice steady. "We've got everything we need. The story's already gone live." Victor's face twisted with rage as he turned to Sarah. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled. "You think you can stop me?" Sarah didn't flinch. "I already have," she said. The police moved in, surrounding Victor and his men. Clara watched as Victor was handcuffed, his cold eyes locking onto hers one last time before he was led away. The days that followed were a whirlwind of media coverage and public outrage. Sarah's exposé had gone viral, and the names of those involved in the Blackwood Asylum experiments were splashed across every news outlet. Victor Hargrove and his associates were arrested, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. Clara and her father were hailed as heroes, but the victory felt hollow. The scars of what they had uncovered, and what they had been a part of, would never fully heal. One evening, Clara stood in front of Blackwood Asylum, the crumbling building now surrounded by police tape and news vans. She had come to say goodbye, to finally lay Evelyn's spirit to rest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm sorry for what they did to you. But it's over now. You're free." As she turned to leave, she felt a cold breeze brush against her skin, and for a moment, she thought she heard a faint whisper on the wind. "Thank you." Clara smiled through her tears, her heart aching but at peace. Evelyn was free, and so was she. The story of Blackwood Asylum became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the horrors that can be committed in the name of progress. And though the scars of the past would always remain, Clara knew that she had done the right thing, not just for Evelyn, but for all the forgotten patients who had suffered in silence. As she walked away from the asylum, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, Clara felt a sense of hope. The darkness had been exposed, and the truth had set them free. Name of the next story: The Curse of the Red Moon. Under the blood-red sky, the village of Vallis Hollow stood quiet, its crumbling stone buildings surrounded by dense forests and rolling hills. The village was small, so small in fact that most people didn't even have to look far to see everyone they knew. There were no visitors, no tourists. Only the villagers, living their quiet, simple lives, unaware of the curse that had plagued them for centuries. Tonight, however, something was different. Tonight, the moon would turn red, a rare occurrence that hadn't been seen in the village for over 100 years. The elders spoke of it with fear, warning everyone of the terrible events that would follow. They said that once the moon turned red, the curse would awaken, and the villagers would be transformed into something inhuman. But no one paid much attention to their warnings. After all, it was just an eclipse, right? Lena stood in the doorway of her cottage, looking up at the sky. The air was thick with anticipation. She could feel the weight of the night pressing down on her, as though something was about to happen, something she couldn't yet understand. She had heard the whispers from the elders, but she didn't believe in curses. Curses were for old stories, told by those who had too much time on their hands. Still, as the sun sank lower, she couldn't help but feel uneasy. The villagers had begun to gather in the town square, waiting for the moon to rise, all of them curious, but also fearful. Her grandmother, Maris, had been one of the elders. She had passed away only a year ago, but her words still haunted Lena. When the red moon rises, you must leave the village. You must not stay, her grandmother had said over and over again. Lena had laughed it off, but now, as the night drew closer, she wasn't so sure. The moon had begun its ascent into the sky, and the first hints of red were visible at its edge. A chill ran through Lena's spine. She turned to go back inside, but a voice from the square caught her attention. It was the voice of Eldrick, one of the oldest villagers and the one most vocal about the curse. "Gather around. The time has come," Eldrick shouted, his old face twisted with fear. His eyes were wide, and his hands trembled. "Remember what I told you. When the moon turns red, we must." His voice was cut off by a sudden, sharp howl from the woods. The sound echoed through the trees, a deep, guttural noise that made Lena's heart race. The villagers froze, looking toward the forest with wide, fearful eyes. "Stay inside," Eldrick cried, his voice shaking. "Do not go outside until the moon has passed." But it was too late. The moon was rising higher now, the red color deepening, spreading across its surface like bloodstains on a canvas. As the moon grew fuller, the air seemed to grow thicker. It was as though the entire village was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. A figure appeared in the square, moving slowly, almost deliberately, toward the group of villagers gathered by the old fountain. It was an elderly woman, her back hunched, her face hidden beneath a tattered hood. She walked with a cane, tapping it against the cobblestones with each step. Her presence sent a shiver through the crowd. "Eldrick," the woman said, her voice cracked like old wood, "the time has come. We cannot stop it now." Lena recognized her instantly. It was Mara, the village healer, a woman who had been silent for years. Her eyes were clouded, her movements slow, as if the very act of walking was an effort. "What do you mean, Mara?" Eldrick demanded, his voice filled with panic. "The curse, it's just a legend." Mara's laugh was soft, yet it carried an eerie, haunting quality. "No, Eldrick, it's not a legend. It's a truth, one that we've ignored for too long." As she spoke, the moon seemed to glow even brighter, its red hue filling the sky with an ominous, unnatural light. The villagers stood frozen, their eyes wide with fear. Lena felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up, her heart pounding in her chest. "It's happening," Mara whispered, more to herself than anyone else. "The transformation has begun." And then, one by one, the villagers began to change. At first, it was subtle. Lena noticed one man in the crowd, a young farmer named Jonas, staggering as if something were wrong with his legs. He dropped to his knees, clutching his stomach, and let out a terrible scream. His body twisted, contorted, as if something inside him was trying to break free. His skin began to darken, turning a sickly gray, and his fingers lengthened, turning into sharp, claw-like appendages. His face elongated, his eyes turning a bright, unnatural yellow. Lena gasped, stepping back, her mind racing. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, watching in horror as the man she had known all her life turned into something monstrous. Jonas didn't scream anymore. He didn't make any sound at all as he stood up, his new form towering over the villagers. His mouth opened wide, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. He turned toward the others, and in a low, guttural voice he growled, "You should have listened." More villagers began to change. Some were quick, transforming in seconds, their bodies bending and breaking like brittle branches in a storm. Others took longer, their faces twisted in pain as the transformation tore through them. It wasn't just their bodies that changed, their very essence seemed to shift, as if the curse was not just physical but spiritual. Lena's heart raced as she watched in horror. She could hear the whispers of the elders in her mind, their warnings echoing through the chaos. "Leave the village," they had said. "When the red moon rises, you must leave." But it was too late. The transformation was happening too quickly. There was nowhere to run. She turned to Mara, hoping for some explanation, but the healer was no longer standing where she had been. Instead, there was only a strange, black mist swirling in the place she had stood, as if she had never been there at all. Lena turned, searching for some sign of hope, but the sight of the villagers, now twisted in human creatures, drove any hope from her mind. They were coming for her now, their eyes glowing with a predatory hunger. Their bodies were hunched, their movements jerky and unnatural as they advanced, their claws scraping against the cobblestones. She ran. Her legs moved faster than they ever had before, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She didn't look back, not even once, as she sprinted through the streets of the village. She had to get away. She had to escape the curse, the nightmare that was unfolding around her. But where could she go? The entire village was being consumed, transformed into something else, something dark and wrong. There was no escaping it, not now, not with the moon still high in the sky, glowing red like a beacon of doom. Lena stumbled into the woods, her mind a blur of panic and fear. She didn't know how long she had been running, but she couldn't stop. Every time she slowed, she could hear the sounds of the creatures, her former neighbors, following close behind. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, and Lena fell to the ground, her knees scraping against the rough earth. She turned, her heart stopping as she saw one of the creatures standing just a few feet away. It was Jonas, or what had once been Jonas, his eyes glowing yellow, his sharp claws outstretched. He reached for her. She screamed, scrambling backward, but there was nowhere to go. The creature smiled, a wicked grin that stretched unnaturally wide. "You should have listened," it said, its voice no longer human. Lena's body shook with terror, her breath shallow and fast. She could feel the red moon above her, its light casting everything in an eerie glow, as though the world itself was bending to the curse that had been awakened. The last thing she heard before everything went dark was the sound of the creature's laugh, echoing through the forest like the death knell of a world that would never be the same again. Lena's world was consumed by darkness, the red moon's eerie light fading as she collapsed onto the cold ground. Her body lay still, her mind trapped in a fog, unsure if she was dreaming or caught in some dreadful nightmare. Every breath felt like a struggle, her chest tight with fear and the oppressive weight of the curse that had overtaken the village. When her eyes finally fluttered open, the forest around her seemed unfamiliar, distorted, twisted, as though reality itself had been warped by the moon's crimson glow. The trees loomed tall, their branches curling like claws, casting long, shadowy arms that reached across the ground. There was no sound except for the rustling of leaves in the wind, but even that seemed wrong. The wind carried something, an unnatural chill, a whisper of something ancient and forgotten. Lena sat up, her hands trembling as she brushed dirt and leaves from her clothes. She could still hear the distant howls of the transformed villagers, their voices carrying through the trees. They were hunting, she knew. They were coming for her. She forced herself to her feet, her legs weak, as though the earth itself had become unsteady beneath her. She stumbled forward, not daring to look back. The path through the forest was narrow, winding, and she had no idea where it led. The only thing she knew was that she couldn't stop moving. Not now. Suddenly she froze. A low growl echoed through the woods, a sound that didn't belong in the natural world. It was a deep, guttural noise, followed by a rustling sound like something, or someone, pushing through the underbrush. Her heart skipped a beat. She turned her head slowly, trying to make out what was in the distance. Between the trees, she saw movement, dark shapes, twisted figures moving in her direction. They were close now. Too close. Lena turned and ran again, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift and buckle, as though the very earth was rejecting her presence. She pushed through the underbrush, her arms scraped by branches as she fought to move faster, but her legs were growing weaker. She could feel the exhaustion in her bones, the crushing weight of fear in her chest. And then she saw it, the clearing ahead. A dim light flickered in the distance, casting shadows that danced in the night. It was a lantern, its flame weak and flickering, barely able to stand against the darkness. Lena's heart leapt in her chest as she ran toward it, praying that someone, anyone, would be there. As she reached the clearing, the sight that greeted her made her stop dead in her tracks. The lantern was hanging from a post, but there was no one in sight. The clearing was eerily quiet, save for the distant sounds of the creatures still hunting in the woods. But what caught Lena's attention was the figure standing in the center of the clearing, a tall, thin man draped in tattered robes. His face was hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, but Lena could sense something off about him, something ancient. "Who are you?" Lena gasped, her voice hoarse, barely above a whisper. The man turned slowly, his movements unnaturally deliberate. His eyes, when they finally met hers, were glowing an unnatural shade of red, their gaze piercing through the darkness. "I am the keeper of the curse," he said, his voice a low rasp, like the whisper of wind through dead leaves. "And you, my dear, are too late." Lena's heart pounded in her chest. "What do you mean? What's happening to the village? Why are they?" "The curse is awakening," the man interrupted, stepping closer, his presence sending a chill down Lena's spine. "And you, like the others, are a part of it. The red moon has marked you, marked all of you." Lena shook her head, confusion and terror flooding her thoughts. "But I'm not like them. I didn't." "You didn't believe," the man said, his voice cold, cutting through her like ice. "And now you will suffer the consequences." He took another step forward, his eyes glowing brighter. "There is no escape from the curse. It has taken root in the very blood of your people, passed down through generations." Lena stumbled back, her mind racing. "No, I can't. I won't." The man's expression didn't change, his eyes burning with an unsettling intensity. "You can try to run, try to fight it, but the red moon always claims its own. Those who are marked will become what they were always meant to be." A sudden crash from behind her made Lena whirl around. The sounds of snapping branches and heavy footsteps were growing louder, closer. She spun back to the man, but he was gone. In his place, only the lantern swayed gently in the breeze, casting eerie shadows across the ground. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Lena saw them, figures emerging from the trees, their movements jerky and unnatural. They were the villagers, but not the villagers she remembered. Their faces were twisted, their eyes glowing yellow, their mouths twisted into grotesque, hungry smiles. They were no longer human. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as she took a step back, her legs shaking. The creatures were closing in, their eyes fixed on her, their breath ragged and cold in the night air. One of them, the man she had once known as Elias, stepped forward. His form was skeletal, his skin stretched tight over his bones, and his face was a nightmare. His lips were pulled back into a grin that was both terrifying and sadistic, his sharp teeth glinting in the moonlight. "You should have listened, Lena. Elias said, his voice rasping. The curse has claimed us all. There's no way out. Lena couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Her body was frozen, her feet unwilling to move. The creatures were so close now, their claws reaching toward her, their eyes burning with a hunger that made her stomach churn. Suddenly, a voice broke through the haze of terror. A familiar voice. Lena, run! It was Mara's voice. Lena turned, her heart leaping in her chest. Mara stood at the edge of the clearing, her form faint and ghostly, but there nonetheless. She held out her hand, her face filled with urgency. Go! Before it's too late. Lena didn't hesitate. She pushed herself forward, her legs shaking beneath her as she sprinted toward Mara. The creatures shrieked in anger behind her, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. All that mattered was getting away from the nightmare that was consuming the village. Mara didn't move. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her form flickering like a candle in the wind. This way, she urged, her voice strained. Lena pushed forward, ignoring the growing darkness around her. She had to escape. She had to survive. The red moon was still high above, its ominous glow casting everything in an unnatural light. But as she reached Mara, the ground beneath her feet began to shift, the very earth trembling with the weight of something ancient and malevolent. The air grew colder, and Lena felt an invisible force pulling her toward the center of the clearing, toward the lantern. No, she cried out, struggling against the pull, but it was too strong. The red moon above was pulling at her, its influence corrupting everything it touched. And just as Lena reached out toward Mara, everything went black. Lena's world swirled in darkness, a crushing silence that seemed to echo within her skull. For what felt like an eternity, she could feel nothing, not even her own breath. Then, a sudden sharp pain shot through her chest, like something was tearing at her from the inside. She gasped, her eyes snapping open. But there was no light, just an endless void, the red moon above casting an eerie glow that seemed to pulse in time with her own heartbeat. She was no longer in the clearing, no longer with Mara. The ground beneath her was cold and smooth, as if she was lying on stone. Her arms and legs felt heavy, as though they were bound by an invisible force. "Where am I?" Lena whispered, her voice barely a sound in the vast emptiness. A soft, almost imperceptible sound reached her ears, like the rustling of fabric. She turned her head, trying to make sense of the darkness, but she couldn't see anything clearly. And yet, she felt the presence of something, someone watching her. A voice, distant and soft, floated to her from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." Lena's heart skipped a beat. The voice was low, familiar, but twisted, like it was coming from somewhere deep inside her mind. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling with fear. The voice laughed softly, but there was no joy in it. Only coldness, as if it had long forgotten what warmth was. "It's already too late for you." Lena struggled, trying to sit up, but the weight on her chest was unbearable. She couldn't move, couldn't escape. It was like something was holding her in place, binding her to the ground with invisible chains. Her body felt disconnected from her mind, as if she were floating in a dark void, unable to find her bearings. Who are you?" she gasped, her breath quickening as panic began to rise in her chest. "What do you want from me?" The voice didn't respond immediately. Instead, the ground beneath her shifted. Slowly, painfully, the darkness around her began to change. The air grew colder still, and Lena could feel a cold wind brushing against her skin, though she couldn't see where it came from. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. A tall, dark silhouette, its features hidden beneath a hood, just like the man she had seen earlier. The figure stepped closer, its presence casting an oppressive weight upon her, making it difficult to breathe. "You have already made your choice," the figure said, its voice harsh, like dry leaves scraping together. "You're a part of this now, and there is no going back." Lena's heart raced as she tried to comprehend what was happening. The figure's words didn't make sense. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The figure stepped closer, its long robes trailing behind it like the tendrils of some dark, living thing. The curse, it said. The blood of your people flows through you, just like it does through the others. You are marked by the red moon, and now you must face the consequences. Lena's eyes widened in horror. You don't understand? The figure's voice was mocking, dripping with disdain. No one does until it's too late. The village has always been a part of this, trapped in the cycles of the curse. And now you will join us. Lena shook her head, her breath coming faster as her panic surged. No, I won't. I won't become like them. I won't let the curse take me. But the figure didn't respond to her words. Instead, it raised a long, bony hand and pointed toward the red moon, now hanging like a scarlet eye in the sky. The moon calls to all of you, it whispered. The time of reckoning is at hand. Lena's eyes followed the figure's gesture, and her stomach twisted as she stared at the glowing orb above. The moon pulsed with a terrible, unnatural light, its color deepening with every passing second. She could feel the weight of its gaze, pressing down on her, suffocating her in its pull. Her chest tightened, her breathing shallow and rapid. "What's happening to me?" she gasped. "Why can't I move?" The figure's lips twisted into a smile, though the expression held no warmth. The curse has already begun its work. You've seen it happen to others. Now it's your turn. Lena's heart pounded as her body began to tremble uncontrollably. She could feel something changing inside her, something dark and ancient, like a force awakening from a long slumber. The air around her seemed to warp, distorting in unnatural ways, as if the very fabric of reality was unraveling. "No," she whispered, her hands shaking as she clutched at the ground beneath her, trying to steady herself. "No, this can't be happening." The figure's laughter echoed through the void. "There is no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone." And then, before Lena could react, the world around her shifted again. The dark, oppressive void gave way to a familiar sight, the village. But it was wrong. The houses, the streets, the very air itself, it was all tainted, corrupted by the curse that had been set in motion. The villagers, her family, her friends, were no longer human. They had transformed into monstrous, twisted versions of themselves, their eyes glowing with the same yellow fire that had consumed Elias. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she saw them, lurking in the shadows of the village, their forms grotesque and twisted, their eyes glowing like the red moon. The curse had already taken hold of them, and there was nothing left of the people she had known. Her gaze turned to the sky, where the red moon loomed, its light growing ever more intense. It seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, calling to her, drawing her toward it. "No," Lena gasped, shaking her head in denial. "I can't." But before she could finish her thought, a figure appeared before her. Mara, her once friend, now a shadow of the girl Lena had known, her eyes dark and hollow, her face twisted into a twisted grimace. "Mara," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. Mara's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile that sent chills down Lena's spine. "You didn't listen," she said, her voice a hollow, eerie echo. "And now you'll join us. We're all part of the curse now. All of us." Lena stumbled back, fear gnawing at her insides. No, I'm not like you. I won't let this happen." But Mara stepped forward, her eyes burning with the same cursed fire. "You have no choice," she said softly. "You were always meant to be a part of this." Lena's body went cold, the darkness closing in around her, the red moon shining down upon the cursed village. The transformation had begun. Lena's heart hammered in her chest as the weight of Mara's words sank in. "I won't let this happen," she whispered fiercely, though the fear clung to her every syllable. But Mara, no, whatever Mara had become, took another step closer, her form flickering like a dying candle. There was no warmth in her smile, no trace of the girl Lena had once known. The curse had hollowed her out, turned her into something inhuman. Her skin was pale, stretched tight across her bones, and her eyes glowed like two fiery orbs, casting a sinister red light across her face. "You already have," Mara said, her voice chillingly calm. "The curse doesn't care about your resistance. You were marked the moment you were born into this village." Lena staggered back, her legs shaking, unable to tear her gaze away from the nightmarish figure of her friend. "No," she whispered again, as though saying the word would somehow change the reality around her. She reached for her own chest, where her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She could feel it now, the same dark power spreading through her veins, wrapping itself around her soul, pulling her toward the moon. The curse had her too. "No," Lena muttered, a knot of horror tightening in her stomach. She was too late. The ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble, as though the earth itself was alive, breathing with the curse that had taken root in every corner of the village. The red moon hung overhead, its unnatural light flickering like the pulse of a beating heart, casting its long shadow over the twisted forms of the villagers. Mara's smile widened, her teeth now sharp, jagged like the claws of some monstrous creature. "You think you can escape this? You think you can fight it? It's too late, Lena. Too late for all of us." Lena swallowed hard, her throat tight with fear and disbelief. "No, I'll find a way to stop this," she said, though it sounded more like a plea than a statement. She couldn't give in. She couldn't let it win. The transformation had already begun, she realized. The villagers, those she had grown up with, were no longer the people they once were. They were twisted, corrupted, their minds and bodies warped by the curse of the red moon. They were monsters now, but there had to be a way to stop it. There had to be a way to undo the curse, to save whatever was left of her people. She couldn't let this be the end. "You still don't understand, do you?" Mara's voice echoed through Lena's mind, as if the very air itself was tainted by her words. "There is no cure. There is no salvation. The red moon comes to claim what is hers, and we belong to her now." Lena shook her head, her body trembling as she took a hesitant step backward. Her legs felt like lead, as though they were weighed down by some unseen force. Her breath came in short gasps, her pulse quickening as the red moon loomed above them, its light growing brighter with every passing moment. The villagers, no, the creatures, were closing in. Their glowing eyes tracked her every movement, their claws scraping against the ground, as if eager to claim her. But Lena refused to give up. She couldn't. "What do you want from me?" Lena shouted, her voice breaking with desperation. "Why me?" Mara's expression softened, just for a moment. A flicker of something resembling pity, before it was replaced by cold, cruel indifference. "You think you're different? You think you can outrun destiny? The curse knows no mercy. It doesn't care who you were before. It only cares about the blood." Lena's mind raced, desperate to find some way out, some way to stop what was happening to her. But every thought felt clouded, like she was trapped in a fog, struggling to see through the haze of fear and uncertainty. There had to be something, a way to break the curse, a way to stop the moon from claiming more victims. Then it hit her. The village's legends, the stories the elders used to whisper when they thought no one was listening. The ancient curse, the red moon, it was all connected. The villagers had spoken of it in hushed tones, afraid to speak too loudly in case the curse would hear them. The curse could be broken, they had said. If the one who is marked by the red moon could destroy the source of its power, the curse would be lifted. The words echoed in Lena's mind, a glimmer of hope cutting through the darkness. She wasn't just a victim. She could be the key to ending this nightmare. But the cost, what would it cost her? "I won't let this happen," Lena repeated, more forcefully this time, finding the strength to stand tall despite the terror clawing at her chest. Her eyes locked with Mara's, no, the creature who used to be her friend, and she stood her ground. "I'm going to end this, one way or another." Mara tilted her head, an expression of amusement flickering on her twisted face. "And how do you think you're going to do that?" she asked, voice dripping with mockery. The curse is beyond you. It's already begun. You can't stop it. I'll find a way, Lena said, her voice filled with determination. She didn't know how, didn't know what she had to do, but she knew one thing. She wouldn't just lie down and let the curse consume her too. The creatures around her, twisted reflections of the people she once knew, began to circle, their hunger palpable in the air. Their eyes glowed with that same fiery, insatiable hunger. They were drawn to her, like sharks to blood. Lena had no choice now. She had to fight. She had to escape this circle of madness. The longer she stayed in the village, the more it would change her. The curse was feeding on her fear, on her doubt. If she let it consume her, she would become one of them. She took a deep breath, her hands trembling, but she forced her feet to move. She wasn't sure where to go, but she couldn't stay here, surrounded by these twisted monsters. The red moon above cast its sickly light on everything, and she could feel the pull of its power, its oppressive weight pressing down on her. But she wasn't going to let it control her. Not yet. She ran. The creatures hissed in unison, their twisted limbs reaching for her. But she was already gone, darting through the narrow, winding streets of the village. Every footstep echoed in her ears, but Lena didn't dare look back. She didn't want to see their hungry eyes, their twisted faces. There was a way out. There had to be. And she would find it, no matter the cost. Lena's breath came in ragged gasps as her feet pounded against the cold, cracked earth of the village streets. The houses, once familiar and comforting, now looked like the hollow shells of abandoned memories, their windows like dark, empty eyes watching her every move. The red moon loomed high above, casting a terrifying glow on the world below, distorting everything it touched. Every shadow seemed alive, creeping toward her, reaching for her like the claws of some ancient creature that had awoken from a long slumber. She could hear the twisted villagers behind her, their footsteps a rhythmic, almost hypnotic beat, growing louder with every passing moment. Their unnatural movements, quick and jerky, echoed through the narrow alleyways as they pursued her. But Lena didn't dare look back. She couldn't. If she did, she might lose what little courage she had left. Her mind raced as she ran, thoughts tumbling over one another like a cascade of water. The curse, she thought. I need to find the source. I need to find a way to stop it. She had heard the legends, the stories whispered by the elders, but they were always told in hushed tones, like secrets too dangerous to utter aloud. No one had ever dared question the curse, because no one had ever dared survive it. But Lena couldn't just give in. She couldn't let the red moon swallow her, too. The streets twisted and turned, the village now unrecognizable, as if the very land had been warped by the curse. The houses seemed to bend in on themselves, the walls leaning inward like they were closing in on her. It was as if the village itself were alive, shifting, bending, suffocating her in its unnatural grip. A sharp cry rang out from behind her. Lena didn't have to turn to know that one of the creatures had gotten closer. The sound of their breathing, deep, guttural, almost feral, filled the air. The hunger was palpable, the air thick with the stench of decay. She stumbled, nearly losing her footing, but she caught herself, her hands scraping against the rough ground. Her heart hammered in her chest as she pushed herself forward, determined not to fall into the grip of whatever had taken her village. Up ahead, she saw a familiar shape, a large stone structure looming in the distance. The village church. It had always been a place of comfort for her as a child, a sanctuary where the villagers came to pray and seek solace. But now it seemed like a twisted mockery of what it once was. The door, once a welcoming entrance, stood open, the darkness inside seeming to pulse and breathe, as though the building itself were waiting for her. Lena's feet carried her there without a second thought. The church was her only hope, the only place she could think of where she might find answers. She burst through the door, the heavy wooden frame creaking under her force. The inside of the church was suffocatingly dark, the only light coming from the eerie glow of the red moon filtering through the cracked stained glass windows. The pews, once neatly arranged, were now overturned, their wooden frames splintered and broken. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, and the once sacred space now felt like a tomb, waiting for its next victim. Lena stumbled forward, her legs weak with exhaustion, but her resolve never faltered. She had to find the source of the curse. She had to stop it before it consumed her, before it consumed them all. The altar loomed before her, bathed in the unnatural red light. It was the only thing untouched by the chaos around her, its stone surface cold and smooth, untouched by the twisted hands of the cursed villagers. But as she drew closer, Lena's eyes caught something, a symbol carved into the stone, glowing faintly in the dim light. It was an ancient mark, something she had seen in the village's old texts, in the stories told by the elders. A symbol of an ancient power, one that had bound the village to the curse of the red moon for centuries. This was the source. Lena's heart raced as she knelt before the altar, her hand trembling as she traced the symbol. There was a hollow, almost imperceptible hum beneath her fingers, a vibration that seemed to resonate deep within her chest. The curse had rooted itself here, in this place. It had been waiting for her. A soft, rasping noise came from behind her. Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was too familiar. The creatures were here. They had found her. Lena, a voice called, low and guttural, like a whisper carried on the wind. Her head snapped around, her heart pounding in her chest. There, standing in the doorway of the church, was Mara. But this wasn't Mara. The transformation was complete. The girl who had once been her friend was now a nightmarish figure, her skin stretched tight over her bones, her eyes glowing with a sickly yellow fire. Her mouth was open, revealing sharp, jagged teeth, and her hands were clawed, twitching with hunger. "You can't escape, Lena," Mara rasped. "The curse belongs to us all now. You are one of us." Lena's stomach twisted, her throat tightening. She could hear the other creatures behind Mara, their heavy breathing filling the room like a tidal wave. They were closing in, their eyes burning with that same fiery glow. The curse had taken them, body and soul, and there was no returning from it. "No," Lena said, her voice shaky but defiant. "I won't be like you. I won't become part of this. I'll stop it." Mara's lips curled into a twisted grin. "You're too late. It's already started. The blood moon has risen, and once it's full, you'll be just like us." Lena backed away, her eyes darting around the church. There had to be a way. There had to be a way to stop it. She could feel the curse pulling at her, whispering in her mind, trying to turn her into one of them. But she fought back, pushing it down with every ounce of strength she had left. She looked back at the altar. The symbol glowed brighter now, pulsing with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. It was feeding off her fear, off her desperation. But Lena refused to let it control her. She had to break it. She had to destroy whatever power bound this curse to her village. Her eyes locked on the symbol. She didn't know how, but she knew she had to destroy it. If she could destroy the source of the curse, maybe, just maybe, she could stop it from spreading. She wasn't going to die here. She wasn't going to let Mara or the others win. Summoning every ounce of willpower she had left, Lena stepped toward the altar. "I will end this," she whispered, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. With a cry of defiance, she slammed her palm against the symbol, feeling the cold stone vibrate beneath her touch. A pulse of energy surged through her, sending a wave of agony through her chest. But Lena gritted her teeth and pushed forward, pressing harder against the symbol, refusing to let the curse consume her. And then, with a final deafening crack, the symbol shattered. The moment the symbol shattered, the ground beneath Lena's feet trembled. The red moon outside seemed to pulse in time with the energy that coursed through the church, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. A deafening roar echoed through the building, a sound so filled with rage and power that it nearly knocked Lena off her feet. Her vision blurred, and for a moment, she thought she might lose consciousness. But she held on, her hands still pressed against the broken symbol. A wave of cold swept over her, making her skin prickle with an unnatural chill. The air itself seemed to thicken, swirling around her like some kind of malevolent storm, as though the curse was reacting to her defiance. The creatures, Mara and the others, howled in unison, their voices shrill and twisted, the sound grating against Lena's eardrums like nails on a chalkboard. They were in pain, she realized. The curse was fighting back, trying to keep its grip on them. But they were losing. The power that had bound the villagers to the red moon was slipping away, and with it, their monstrous forms began to flicker like the flames of a dying fire. Lena staggered back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her body felt heavy, like the weight of the entire village was pressing down on her, but she couldn't stop. She had to keep going. The altar had been the source, the heart of the curse, but the power of the red moon still hung in the air, tainting everything it touched. If she didn't do something now, the curse might simply reassert itself. She turned, her eyes scanning the church. The villagers, no, the creatures, were still in the doorway, their forms flickering and warping as the curse tried to hold them together. Mara's figure was the most unstable of all, her body flickering in and out of existence, like a shadow that could no longer stay in the light. Mara's voice, hollow and distorted, came from somewhere behind her. "You think you've won? You think you can stop it? You are nothing but a fool, Lena." Lena didn't answer. She couldn't. Every inch of her body screamed for rest, but she knew there was no time. The moon was still full, its blood-red light casting everything in an eerie glow. She had broken the symbol, but the curse was still there, still alive in the air, in the land, in the villagers. She had to destroy it completely. She turned back to the altar. The cracks in the stone were spreading, the energy seeping out like a slow-moving poison. The air was thick with it, and the entire church seemed to be pulsing with a life of its own. Lena closed her eyes and took a deep breath, gathering what little strength she had left. "By the earth," she whispered, her voice trembling, "by the sky, by the blood of those who came before." Her words faltered as she struggled to recall the ancient incantation that she had heard once as a child, the prayers the elders had recited during the village's darkest days, when they spoke of the red moon's power. They had whispered that if the curse was ever to be broken, it would take more than just strength. It would take something deeper, something connected to the land itself. Lena's hand gripped the broken stone of the altar as her voice grew stronger. "I call upon the blood that binds us all. I call upon the earth to cleanse what is cursed." A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the church as Lena felt the ground beneath her feet shift. The very air seemed to thicken, as if the village itself was responding to her call. The walls groaned in protest, and the red light from the moon seemed to dim, as though the curse itself was recoiling. But then Mara's voice broke through, louder and more insistent, like a scream from the depths of the earth. "No, you can't." Lena's vision blurred, her mind feeling like it was splitting in two, but she kept her hands pressed against the altar, unwilling to let go. She didn't know if the incantation would work. She didn't know if it would be enough to stop the curse, but she had no other choice. Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet shattered, and a cold wind blew through the church, extinguishing the last of the red moon's glow. A deep, rumbling roar shook the building to its core, and the earth seemed to cry out in agony. And then all at once it stopped. The silence was suffocating. Lena gasped for air, her body trembling with exhaustion, and her hands slick with sweat. The weight that had been pressing on her chest, on her soul, lifted, just for a moment. She opened her eyes, but the world around her seemed to blur, as if the curse had not yet fully been lifted. Mara and the other creatures were gone. The doorway was empty, the flickering shadows no longer present. The church, too, was still, quiet, as though it had been freed from some terrible force. The only thing left was the altar, still cracked but no longer pulsing with the malevolent energy that had once filled the air. But as Lena staggered to her feet, her heart still pounding in her chest. She knew that this wasn't over. Not yet. She stumbled to the door, pushing it open with a heavy hand. The village was silent, too silent. The houses, once alive with the cursed villagers, were now empty, abandoned, their windows shattered, their doors hanging loosely on their hinges. The red moon hung low in the sky, its glow no longer tainting everything with its terrible light. But the village was still empty in a way that terrified her more than any monster could. Lena took a step out into the street, her breath shallow, her body aching with exhaustion. The curse had not taken her, but it had taken everything else. She glanced up at the sky once more, the remnants of the red moon fading behind the clouds, as if something had finally taken it away. But the village around her felt dead, frozen in time. The curse had left its mark, not just on the villagers, but on the land itself. And Lena knew, no matter what she had done, the scars would remain. She had stopped the curse, but it had taken something from her too. The night was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. The silence, heavy with loss and grief, hung in the air. Lena wasn't sure how long it would last, or if the curse would ever truly be gone. But she was alive, and that was enough for now. Lena's feet felt numb beneath her as she walked through the desolate village, each step echoing in the suffocating silence. The streets, once bustling with the familiar hum of daily life, now felt like an empty shell, hollow, abandoned, and frozen in the wake of the curse's aftermath. The moon, no longer blood-red, had dulled into a sickly pale hue, hanging low in the sky as if it, too, mourned what had happened. She glanced around, her heart heavy with the weight of loss. The village had been her home, a place where memories of laughter and simple joys had once filled the air. Now, it was just a graveyard of those memories. The villagers, her friends, her family, had been taken by the curse, and though the moon had faded, the village would never be the same. Lena stopped at the edge of the village square, where the fountain had once flowed with clear water, the centerpiece of the community. But now the fountain stood still, its stone basin cracked and dry, the water long gone, as if it too had been drained of life. A single, tattered banner hung from a nearby post, fluttering weakly in the breeze. It was the same banner that had once been used for celebrations, festivals, and weddings. Now, it looked like a symbol of defeat, a silent witness to the destruction of everything that had once been. She swallowed hard, her throat tight, and walked toward the church once more, though she had no idea what she was searching for. It felt like there was something still calling her there, something left undone, a thread she hadn't yet unraveled. As she reached the church doors, she hesitated, her hand resting on the cold wood. The place felt different now. No longer a place of refuge, it was a place of memories, of ancient power, of darkness. She stepped inside, the sound of her shoes scraping against the stone floor too loud in the quiet. The altar, still cracked, still broken, stood before her, its energy now dormant, but the air was thick with something else. Something she couldn't quite place. Lena reached out and touched the stone, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of the broken symbol. It had shattered, but the power it had held, the curse, the blood moon, lingered. She could feel it, a pulse, faint but still there. Her breath caught as she looked around the room, her mind reeling. Was it truly over? Had the curse really been broken, or was it simply lying dormant, waiting for the next lunar cycle to rise again? The villagers were gone, but the land, was still scarred, tainted by what had happened. The red moon had left its mark on everything it touched. But then, as she stood there, the quiet stretching on for what seemed like an eternity, something moved in the shadows at the back of the church. Her heart leaped into her throat, and she whipped around, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't sure what she expected to see. Maybe one of the creatures, one of the cursed villagers, come back to life. But there was nothing, just the oppressive silence. Lena took a step forward, her gaze darting from corner to corner. The flickering candlelight from the altar cast long, distorted shadows across the stone walls, but nothing seemed to move. Still, the feeling of being watched persisted, gnawing at her. Her hands shook as she clenched them into fists, a cold sweat breaking out on her brow. She wasn't alone. She turned toward the doorway, but before she could take another step, a voice rang out, quiet and sharp, like a whisper that cut through the darkness. "Lena." Her blood ran cold. It was a voice she recognized, but it sounded different now, distorted, warped. It wasn't just the echo of the church, it was something else, something older. Lena's heart skipped a beat as she slowly turned around. Standing in the center of the church, her figure barely visible in the dim light, was Mara. But this wasn't the Mara Lena had known. The transformation, the curse, it had done something more to her. Her body was now a grotesque mockery of a human form, her features twisted beyond recognition. Her skin was pale, stretched too thin over her bones, her eyes glowing a sickly yellow, unblinking and fixed on Lena. Lena stumbled back, her chest tight with fear, but her legs wouldn't move fast enough. The creature, Mara, took a slow, deliberate step toward her. "Mara?" Lena's voice broke as she spoke the name. It was barely a whisper. She had thought the curse had taken her completely. But now, it seemed the curse had done something worse than just turn them into monsters. It had erased them, hollowed them out, leaving only the shell of the person they once were. Mara smiled, but the expression was twisted, unnatural, the sharp, jagged teeth glinting in the low light. "You're still here, still fighting." Her voice was hollow, a rasping echo of what it had once been. "But you can't stop it. None of you can." Lena's breath quickened as she backed away further into the church. "No, Mara. I did stop it. The curse is broken. It's over." Mara's laugh was low, almost too soft to hear, but it carried a weight of sorrow and madness in it that chilled Lena to her very core. "Broken? You think you broke it? You can't break something that has lived for centuries. You can't stop something that is as old as the land itself." Lena shook her head, her thoughts scrambling. "No, I destroyed the symbol. I stopped the moon from reaching its peak. It has to be over. It has to be." Mara's eyes glowed brighter now, her movements jerky, as if some unseen force was pulling her strings. "You think the moon was the curse?" "No, Lena. The moon was just a signal, a herald. The curse was never just about the red moon." She stepped closer, and Lena could feel the air grow colder with each movement. "The curse is the land. It's the people. It's you." Lena froze. Her mind raced to keep up with the twisted words that tumbled from Mara's lips. "You are bound to it now," Mara continued, her smile widening into something feral. "You've touched the curse. You've broken the symbol. Now you are part of it." Lena's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I stopped it. I broke the curse." "No," Mara hissed, the edges of her voice snapping with hunger. "You became the curse." Lena's world tilted as the weight of her words began to settle. The truth. She had thought she had freed them, thought she had stopped the red moon, but in doing so, she had sealed herself into something far worse. The curse wasn't gone. It had just shifted, latched onto her, and now it would never let go. The land was cursed, and she was part of it. The church felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were closing in around her. The light from the moon outside was fading, but there was no peace in that. There was only an ominous stillness. Mara's eyes bored into Lena's, and her lips curled into a wicked smile. "Welcome to eternity, Lena." Lena's heart pounded in her chest, every beat like a drum of impending doom. She took a shaky breath, her mind racing to make sense of the madness. Mara's words echoed in her head, a terrible truth that she couldn't escape. "You are part of it." She staggered backward, her hands clutching the edges of the altar for support. Her fingers gripped the cold stone so tightly it was almost painful. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. This curse wasn't just a force that had swept through the village. It was a part of the land itself, a cycle that would never truly be broken. She had thought that by stopping the red moon, She had stopped the curse. But all she had done was postpone it, postpone her own transformation. Mara's figure loomed closer, every step slow and deliberate, as if she were savoring the fear that radiated from Lena. The creature's hollow eyes gleamed in the dim light, and with each passing second, the air around them grew heavier, more suffocating. "You can't escape it, Lena," Mara said, her voice now a whisper that seemed to crawl into Lena's mind. "The curse is in the blood, in the very soil beneath your feet. It is in all of us, and now it's in you." Lena shook her head, her throat tight, but no words came. She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't. She had given everything, fought against everything, believed she had won. But Mara's twisted form, her cold, almost inhuman gaze, made it clear this wasn't over. Mara reached out a skeletal hand, her long fingers curling like claws. "You are one of us now, Lena. There's no going back. The curse has taken you." Lena's eyes darted around the church, her panic growing. The walls seemed to close in, the once grand structure now a prison. Her breath was shallow, her pulse racing. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to become like them. I won't let it happen," Lena whispered, the words barely escaping her lips. But Mara only smiled, a smile that was cruel and sadistic, as if she knew something Lena didn't. "It's not a matter of letting it happen. You can't fight it. It's in your blood, in the land. We're all bound to it." And now, she stepped closer, the air thick with the stench of death and decay. "Now you'll understand." Lena's legs trembled beneath her, but she refused to back down. Her gaze flickered to the door, but she knew there was no escape. The village was alive with the curse now. She could feel it, the pulse beneath her feet, the weight of the land pressing on her. "No," Lena gasped, her voice desperate. "There must be another way. Please." Mara tilted her head, studying Lena with that same cold, unfeeling expression. "You were always meant to be part of this. Your bloodline was chosen long ago. This village, this land, has always been cursed, but you were its next vessel. The cycle has to continue. It always does." The words wrapped around Lena's mind like a vice, squeezing the last remnants of hope out of her. A vessel? She was meant to become one of them. She hadn't stopped the curse. She had only become its latest victim, just like the others before her. Just like Mara. "No," Lena repeated, her voice shaking with raw emotion. "No, I won't let it be me. I won't let it end like this." She turned away from Mara, her mind racing for an answer, any answer. But as her eyes scanned the room, her gaze fell on the altar again, the broken symbol lying in pieces on the floor. The cracks in the stone were still there, still faintly glowing with the cursed energy that had once held the village in its grip. That was it. The symbol had been a key to the curse. But had she truly broken it? Or had she simply displaced it? Her pulse quickened as she realized the terrifying truth. The curse was not bound to the symbol. It was bound to the land itself. The symbol was only a manifestation of that curse, a physical anchor. But the curse had spread far beyond the church, beyond the village. It had seeped into the earth, into the very soil. To break it completely, Lena realized she would have to do something more, something desperate. She turned back to Mara, who was watching her with an amused, almost predatory gleam in her eyes. "You think you can change your fate, Lena? You think you can undo what's been done?" she asked, her voice dripping with mockery. "I can," Lena replied, her voice trembling, but there was something more in her eyes now, something sharp. "I have to." In the silence that followed, Lena felt the weight of the land pressing down on her, urging her to stay still, urging her to give in. The curse was alive in the very air she breathed. It was growing inside of her, wrapping around her heart like a cold, choking vine. But she couldn't let it take her. She stepped forward, the broken symbol still in her hands. She wasn't sure how, but she had to finish what she had started. She had to make the curse understand that she would not be its victim. As her fingers brushed the jagged edges of the broken stone, A surge of energy crackled through her, like lightning coursing through her veins. Pain shot through her body, but she didn't flinch. She held on to the symbol with all the strength she had left. The church trembled as though it, too, were fighting against her will, but Lena gritted her teeth, willing herself to stand firm. The ground beneath her feet began to rumble again, a low growl that made her blood run cold. She could feel the curse pulling at her, like an invisible hand trying to drag her down into darkness. But she wouldn't let it. "I will not be part of this," Lena whispered through gritted teeth. "I will not." The energy surged, building, filling the room with a force so powerful that Lena felt like she might explode. Her body shook with the strain of holding the curse at bay, but she kept her focus on the broken symbol, the broken anchor of the land's curse. And then, with a final, guttural cry, she threw the symbol into the center of the church. It shattered with a deafening crack, sending a shockwave of energy through the air. The entire church shook, the floor cracking beneath her feet, as though the very foundation of the village was giving way. Lena staggered back, her hands gripping the altar for support as the world seemed to twist and bend around her. The air grew thick with darkness, and for a moment, she thought she might lose herself to it. But then, as quickly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The oppressive weight in the air lifted. The curse was gone. Lena collapsed to the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She looked around the church, but the air was still now, silent. Mara was gone, the creature's twisted form evaporating like smoke in the wind. The village was still cursed, but not anymore. She had severed the bond. The land, the people, the curse, they were all free. At least for now. Lena sat there on the cold stone floor, her hands trembling as she tried to steady her breath. Her chest rose and fell with each sharp intake of air, the adrenaline from the ritual still coursing through her veins. She could still feel the residue of the curse clinging to her skin, as if the very air around her was heavy with the remnants of what had been. The church, now eerily still, felt strangely empty. The walls no longer seemed to hum with dark energy. The shadows, which had once lurked in every corner, were simply shadows now, nothing more than the natural consequence of the candlelight flickering against the stone. But there was a profound silence, a kind of stillness that settled into her bones. The chaos had stopped. The shaking had ceased. The curse had been severed, but at what cost? Lena stood shakily to her feet, leaning against the altar for support. Her knees were weak, and her head throbbed from the force of the ritual, but the weight on her chest had lifted. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe. The curse had been broken, and the land, at least for now, was no longer infected by it. But even as she let out a shaky sigh of relief, doubt crept in. Could it truly be over? Could she have really done it? Her eyes flicked to the door that had once seemed like an escape, but now seemed like a threshold to something she wasn't sure she could face. The villagers, the ones who had been transformed, the ones who had been consumed by the curse, were gone. She knew that. She had seen it in their eyes, the monstrous hunger, the twisted expressions. But what had happened to them? What had happened to the people she had known? A cold, empty feeling gnawed at her. She had broken the curse, but it had left its mark on her, just as it had left its mark on the land. What would she become now? Would the village ever return to what it had been? Would she ever feel whole again? Lena walked slowly toward the door, her steps heavy as if the weight of her actions was pulling her down with every movement. The door creaked open, and the moonlight streamed in, pale and soft. The red had faded. The curse had faded. But the village was still there, hanging on the edge of something she couldn't quite understand. As she stepped outside, the cool air hit her like a rush of clarity, and for a moment she stood still, staring at the village before her. It looked unchanged, silent, still, and untouched by the horrors that had transpired within its bounds. But Lena knew better. She had been there. She had felt it. The land was scarred, and the people who had once lived here were gone, transformed into something else entirely. She moved forward, her eyes scanning the houses, the familiar streets that now seemed so distant, so alien. The houses were empty, but there was a lingering presence, an energy that still clung to the buildings. It wasn't the curse anymore, it was the memory of it, a memory that would never truly fade. Even if the land itself had been freed, the people's souls, their pain, their suffering, would remain trapped here forever. Lena's gaze turned to the hill at the edge of the village, where the old oak tree stood. It had always been a landmark, a symbol of the village's strength, a reminder of their connection to the land. Now it was just a lonely, twisted silhouette against the horizon. She had to go there. She wasn't sure why, but something in her knew that was where the last remnants of the curse would lie. Something still unfinished, something that only she could see. Her feet carried her toward the tree without hesitation, the weight of her decision pressing on her chest. As she walked, memories of the village's former life flickered through her mind. Faces of old friends, laughter around the bonfire, the sounds of children playing in the streets. It felt like a lifetime ago. The people she had known, the people she had loved, none of them would ever return. The curse had taken them, had twisted them beyond recognition. It had consumed their bodies, their minds, and now it had consumed her. When she reached the tree, Lena stood still for a long time, staring at the gnarled roots that seemed to pulse with a faint, eerie light. The tree was old, its bark twisted and knotted, but it still stood, defiant against the ravages of time. She couldn't help but wonder how much of the curse was tied to this place. How much of it had been absorbed by this ancient sentinel of the land. She reached out, touching the rough bark with her fingertips. A faint pulse of energy shot up her arm, cold and sharp, like a jolt of electricity. The sensation was brief, but enough to make her pull her hand back quickly. She stepped back, her heart racing. The tree, it was still alive with the remnants of the curse, still holding the pain of the village, the terror of those who had been claimed by it. What had she done? The question rang in her mind, louder than anything else. She had destroyed the symbol. She had broken the curse, but at what cost? Lena sank to her knees in front of the tree, her breath coming fast as tears welled in her eyes. She had fought so hard, had done everything she could to stop the curse, to save the village. But now, it felt like all she had done was open a wound that would never heal. The curse had been broken, but it had left its mark on everything. The land, the people, her. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice breaking. She wasn't sure who she was asking. Maybe herself. Maybe the tree. Maybe the cursed land. Is it finally over? But there was no answer, only the wind rustling the leaves above her, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a sound like the memory of a distant cry, like the land itself mourning its loss. Lena stood, her legs shaky beneath her. She didn't know what to do next. What could she do? The village was gone. The curse was broken, but at what cost? She had severed the link, yes, but it had changed her. And it had changed the land. It would never be the same again. With one last glance at the tree, Lena turned and began to walk away, her steps slow but determined. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that the past, with all its horror and pain, would never truly let go of her. She had freed the village, but she had also become part of its story, part of its curse. The land would carry its scars forever, and so would she. And no matter how far she walked, the memories of the red moon, of the cursed village, would always follow her. But for now, Lena walked on, one step at a time, into the uncertain darkness that lay ahead. Lena wandered down the winding path leading away from the oak tree, her body exhausted and her mind tangled in grief. The silence of the village weighed on her like a shroud, pressing against her ears and settling deep into her chest. Her steps echoed faintly against the cracked stone streets, the sound a stark reminder that she was utterly alone. As she approached the edge of the village, Lena glanced back one final time. The red glow that had dominated the sky for what felt like an eternity had finally faded. leaving the world bathed in pale moonlight. It should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The moon, though no longer cursed, seemed distant and cold, a silent observer to the devastation below. She whispered softly to herself, "I did what I had to do, didn't I?" Her voice cracked at the end, and she bit her lip, forcing herself to keep walking. The weight of her actions felt like an anchor dragging her down, but she couldn't stop now. The ritual had drained her, both physically and emotionally, but something in her gut told her it wasn't over yet. Not completely. The wind picked up, carrying with it faint whispers, just barely audible, like words spoken on the edge of consciousness. Lena froze, her heart thundering in her chest. She spun around, scanning the empty streets, but there was no one there. Only the dark windows of abandoned houses stared back at her, hollow and lifeless. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. The whispers stopped, replaced by an oppressive stillness that made her stomach twist. She took a step back, her hands instinctively clutching the small amulet she had used during the ritual. It was cold against her skin, the metal feeling heavier than it should have. Something about the air felt different now, thicker, heavier, as if the village itself was holding its breath. Lena's fingers tightened around the amulet as she whispered, "It's just the wind, just the wind." But deep down, she knew it wasn't. The curse was broken, yes, but its echoes remained. The village had been scarred by its presence, and those scars would linger, festering beneath the surface like an infection. The land remembered, and it wasn't done with her yet. The whispers returned, louder this time, like a chorus of voices speaking in unison. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, rising and falling with the wind. Lena clutched the amulet tighter, her knuckles white as fear coursed through her veins. She tried to steady her breathing, but the oppressive presence around her made it impossible. "Leave me alone," Lena shouted, her voice echoing through the empty streets. For a moment, the voices fell silent. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then a single voice spoke, a deep, guttural sound that reverberated through the air, shaking Lena to her core. "You cannot run from what you have done," the voice said, slow and deliberate, as if savoring each word. "The curse may be broken, but the price is not yet paid." Lena's blood turned to ice. She turned in circles, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing, only shadows that seemed to shift and writhe at the edges of her vision. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Hadn't she ended it? Hadn't she done everything the ritual required? Why was this still happening? "I did what you asked," Lena shouted into the darkness. "I ended the curse. What more do you want from me?" The voice didn't answer immediately. Instead, the air grew colder, and the shadows around her seemed to stretch and lengthen, reaching for her like dark tendrils. Lena stumbled back, her heart pounding as the realization hit her. She wasn't alone. Something had been left behind, something tied to the curse that refused to let go. "You have freed them," the voice said, its tone filled with dark amusement. "But freedom is not the same as peace." Lena's breath hitched as the ground beneath her feet seemed to shift. She stumbled again, falling to her knees. The amulet in her hand grew unbearably hot, forcing her to drop it. It landed with a dull thud, and for a moment, the whispers grew deafening, surrounding her in an almost tangible wave of sound. "No!" Lena screamed, covering her ears. "I won't let you take me." The whispers suddenly stopped, replaced by a low, rumbling laugh that sent chills down her spine. "You were never meant to leave," the voice said. "The curse binds us all." Before Lena could react, the ground beneath her gave way, and she was falling into darkness. The last thing she saw was the pale light of the moon disappearing above her, swallowed by the shadows. Then there was nothing. Lena's descent felt endless, her body weightless as she tumbled through the black void. She tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her limbs flailed uselessly, and her mind spiraled into panic as she wondered if this was death, an eternal fall into nothingness. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, she hit the ground. Groaning, she opened her eyes and realized she was lying on cold, damp earth. A faint red glow illuminated her surroundings, casting long, flickering shadows on the jagged rock walls around her. She was in a cavern, the air thick with the stench of decay. Her head pounded as she pushed herself up, her hands trembling. "Where am I?" she muttered, her voice barely audible. The red glow pulsed, drawing her attention to the far side of the cavern. There, in the center of the space, stood a massive stone altar. Strange symbols were carved into its surface, glowing faintly with the same crimson light that filled the cavern. Around the altar, shadowy figures loomed, their forms indistinct but undeniably humanoid. They were watching her, their hollow eyes glinting with malice. Lena stumbled backward, her heart racing. "Stay away!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. The figures didn't move. Instead, one of them spoke, its voice low and resonant, reverberating through the space. "You cannot escape your fate, child of the village," it said. "You have severed the curse, but you carry its burden now." Lena shook her head, her back pressing against the cold stone wall behind her. "No, I did everything right. I ended the curse. It's over," she cried. The figure stepped closer, its form becoming slightly more defined in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a dark hood. When it spoke again, its voice was laced with cruel amusement. "You have freed the others, but in doing so, you have bound yourself to the curse. It needs a vessel. It always has." Lena's stomach churned as the weight of its words settled over her. "No, no, that's not true," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I won't be a part of this. I won't let this thing consume me." The figure raised a skeletal hand, pointing toward the altar. "The choice is no longer yours," it said. "Step forward and accept your place, or be torn apart by the darkness." The other shadowy figures began to close in, their hollow eyes glowing brighter. Lena's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she realized she had no way out. The cavern walls seemed to close in around her, the oppressive air making it hard to think. Her gaze flicked to the altar. The red glow pulsed in time with her racing heartbeat, as if calling to her. The amulet she had carried during the ritual was now resting on its surface, vibrating with an eerie energy. Somehow, it had followed her here. Lena clenched her fists, her mind racing. Was this truly her fate? To become the new vessel for the curse? She had fought so hard to save the village, to free its people. But in the end, it seemed the cost was her own soul. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Then louder, "No, I won't let this happen." Summoning every ounce of strength she had left, Lena lunged for the altar. Her fingers closed around the amulet, and the moment she touched it, a blinding light erupted from its surface. The cavern shook violently, and the shadowy figures let out inhuman screams, their forms dissolving into wisps of smoke. The light grew brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. Lena felt a searing pain in her chest, as if the curse itself was fighting to hold on to her. But she held firm, pouring all her will into the amulet. And then there was silence. When the light faded, Lena found herself lying on the forest floor beneath a starless sky. The red moon, which had loomed so ominously over the village, was gone. In its place hung a pale, ordinary moon, casting a soft glow over the trees. The village bell tolled faintly in the distance, a sound so familiar yet distant, as though it belonged to another world. Lena sat up slowly, her body aching and her mind foggy. The amulet lay beside her, now cracked and lifeless, its crimson glow extinguished. She reached out to touch it, but the moment her fingers brushed against its surface, it crumbled into ash. A faint breeze carried the remnants away, leaving no trace of its existence. She stood, swaying slightly, and looked around. Everything seemed eerily still. The forest was silent, not even the chirp of a cricket or the rustle of leaves disturbing the quiet. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet crunching softly on the undergrowth. As she made her way back toward the village, Memories of the cavern flashed through her mind. The shadowy figures, the altar, the searing light. She couldn't be sure if any of it had been real, or if it was some nightmarish hallucination. But the weight in her chest told her otherwise. She had fought something ancient, something malevolent, and somehow she had survived. When Lena reached the edge of the village, she stopped in her tracks. The streets were empty, and the houses stood dark and lifeless. The air was thick with an unsettling stillness, as if the place had been abandoned for years. Her heart sank as she walked through the familiar paths, calling out for anyone, her parents, her friends, anyone who might still be there. "Hello," she called, her voice echoing faintly. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. She reached her family's home and pushed the door open, half expecting to find her parents waiting for her. But the house was cold and empty, the faint scent of ash lingering in the air. A wave of despair crashed over her as she sank to her knees in the doorway. Had she saved the village, or had she destroyed it? Had the curse truly been broken, or had it claimed everything she loved as its final act of vengeance? Tears streamed down her face as she looked up at the sky, searching for some sign, some answer. But there was nothing, just the quiet, indifferent night. Then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, more distinct, until she could make out the words. "Thank you." Lena froze, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was soft and familiar, filled with a warmth that made her chest ache. It sounded like her mother. She looked around, her eyes scanning the shadows, but there was no one there. "Thank you," the voice repeated, fainter this time, as if it was fading away. And then it was gone, leaving Lena alone in the silence once more. She sat there for a long time, her heart heavy but her resolve firm. The village was empty, the curse lifted, and the moon no longer bore its crimson stain. She had done what she set out to do, even if it had cost her everything. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, Lena stood and wiped her tears. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she knew she couldn't stay here. With one last look at the village she had called home, she turned and walked away, her shadow stretching long behind her in the morning light. As Lena walked away from the empty village, a strange calm settled over her. The ache in her chest was unbearable, but she carried it with quiet acceptance. The forest stretched ahead, its shadows thinning in the growing light of dawn. For the first time in days, the oppressive feeling that had haunted her lifted, replaced by a hollow stillness. She didn't know where she was going, but the thought of staying behind, surrounded by echoes of what was lost, felt unbearable. The sun rose higher, illuminating the path before her, though the weight of her memories lingered. She had saved them, the villagers, her family. That was what mattered. Even if they were gone, she had freed them from the curse's grasp. Hours passed before Lena reached the edge of the forest. Ahead, the trees gave way to rolling hills and fields she had never seen before. It was as though the world beyond the village had expanded, offering her an unfamiliar but open horizon. She paused at the edge of the woods, turning one last time to look back at the distant rooftops of the place she had called home. The village was still and quiet, bathed in soft morning light. There was no longer any sign of the red moon, no lingering curse hanging over its streets. For a fleeting moment, Lena thought she saw movement near the square, a faint, spectral figure standing at the well. It raised a hand, as if in farewell, before fading into the light. She closed her eyes, her lips trembling into the faintest of smiles. "Goodbye," she whispered. Turning back to the open road, Lena took her first step into the unknown. The wind carried with it the faintest sound of the village bell, distant and faint, as though it was saying goodbye to her as well. The curse was broken. The village was free. And Lena, though scarred, was alive. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she carried hope in her heart. And so she walked onward, into a world waiting to be rediscovered, leaving behind the shadows of her past. Lena's footsteps crunched against the brittle leaves scattered across the forest path as the distant village disappeared behind her. The further she walked, the harder it became to suppress the memories, their faces, the laughter that had once filled the air, and the warmth of her mother's arms. Now all of it was gone, swept away by the curse that had claimed everything she'd ever known. The silence of the forest was broken by the occasional creak of swaying branches, yet it only served to deepen her loneliness. She glanced down at her trembling hands, the faint cuts and bruises a painful reminder of everything she'd endured. In her palm, she still clutched the locket her mother had given her the day before the eclipse. She opened it, staring at the tiny picture of her family inside. It felt like a relic from another life, one that had slipped through her fingers. "You're free now," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Wherever you are, you're free." Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring her vision as she closed the locket and tucked it safely into her pocket. She knew the pain of her loss would never truly leave her, but the thought that her sacrifice had saved them brought a fragile sense of peace. As the forest began to thin, Lena noticed the golden rays of sunlight streaming through the trees, illuminating the path ahead. The oppressive darkness of the night before was gone, replaced by an almost ethereal glow. A gentle breeze brushed past her, carrying with it the faint scent of wildflowers. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Lena felt the corners of her lips lift into a faint, bittersweet smile. But just as she stepped into the open meadow beyond the forest, something caught her attention. A faint hum vibrated through the air, growing louder with each step. She turned slowly, her heart pounding, as she scanned the treetops for any sign of movement. The sound was unlike anything she had heard before, a low, resonating pulse that seemed to come from the earth itself. Her breath hitched as she noticed something glimmering in the distance, back toward the village. It was faint, like the dying glow of embers, but unmistakably there. "No," she murmured, her voice trembling. She took a step forward, then stopped, frozen by the weight of uncertainty. The curse was supposed to be broken. She had done everything the ritual demanded. So why did it feel like something still lingered? "Leave it," she told herself, forcing her feet to turn away. "It's over. It has to be over." But deep down, a small voice whispered that the red moon's curse was not so easily undone. And as Lena continued her journey into the unknown, the faint hum followed her, a haunting reminder that some curses never truly fade. The meadow stretched endlessly before her, but with each step, the sense of freedom grew weaker. A shadow flickered at the edge of her vision, just for a moment, and she stopped to look back. The forest stood silent, bathed in light, yet the faint hum still vibrated beneath her feet. Lena closed her eyes and gripped the locket tightly. Whatever was left, whatever still lingered, she would face it. After all, she was the last of her village, and it was her burden to bear. With a final deep breath, she turned toward the open road, leaving the past behind. The sun rose higher in the sky, but behind her, the faint shadow of the red moon seemed to linger, its presence woven into the world like a scar that could never fully heal. Lena walked on, determined to survive, even as the echoes of the curse followed her into the horizon. Lena walked through the meadow, her shadow stretching long behind her as the sun climbed higher into the sky. Every step felt heavier, as though the weight of the curse still clung to her, a phantom lingering in her mind. She wanted to believe it was over, that the villagers had been freed, that their suffering had ended. But the faint hum beneath her feet, the way the air seemed too still, told her otherwise. As she crested a hill, she paused, turning back one last time. The village was barely visible now, hidden behind the dense forest, but in her mind's eye, she could still see its narrow streets, the familiar rooftops, the people she had loved. She thought of her mother, her father, her friends, all of them gone, taken by the curse. A pang of grief surged through her, but it was tempered by resolve. "I did what I could," Lena whispered. "I gave everything." The breeze shifted, carrying with it a faint sound. At first, it was barely perceptible, but as Lena strained to listen, her heart sank. It was a faint melody, soft and haunting, like the lullabies her mother used to sing. She froze, her blood turning cold. "Lena!" The voice was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was unmistakably her mother's. Tears welled in Lena's eyes as she turned toward the sound. The forest stood silent, the meadow empty, yet the voice called again, this time clearer, closer. "Come back, Lena!" Her breath hitched as she stumbled backward. It wasn't possible. She had seen her mother transform, had watched her disappear under the crimson glow of the moon. This had to be some lingering trick of the curse, a cruel echo meant to torment her. "No," she said aloud, shaking her head. "You're gone. You're free." But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by the faint hum that now seemed to pulse in rhythm with her racing heart. "Come back, Lena. Don't leave us." She clutched the locket in her hand, her knuckles white. The temptation to turn back was overwhelming, but deep in her heart, she knew the truth. The curse wasn't finished. It wasn't over, and if she returned, it would claim her too. "I'm sorry," Lena whispered, her voice breaking. "I can't." The wind howled around her, carrying the voices of the villagers now, all calling her name, pleading with her to return. The hum grew into a deafening roar, and for a moment, Lena thought the ground might give way beneath her. She dropped to her knees, covering her ears as tears streamed down her face. "Leave me alone," she screamed. And just like that, the noise stopped. The air grew still once more, the meadow bathed in golden light. Lena stayed on the ground, trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. When she finally looked up, the forest and the village beyond were quiet, as though nothing had happened. Lena forced herself to her feet, her legs shaking as she turned away from the past and began walking again. The voices didn't return, but the locket in her hand felt heavier than ever, a constant reminder of what she had lost. The path ahead was uncertain, but Lena knew one thing for sure: she couldn't stop. The curse had taken everything from her, but it hadn't taken her will to survive. As the horizon stretched before her, she whispered a silent prayer for the villagers, for her family, and for herself. And though the hum had faded, somewhere far behind her, in the depths of the forest, the faint shadow of the red moon lingered, watching, waiting, and biding its time. And that's the end of tonight's stories. Keep listening to the sound of rain and fall into a deep, peaceful sleep.